Au, ka tiake, e ngā manu I te rangi, e ngā tōtara haimata o Ngāhere, kei ngā tani whao ngā maunga kei ngā tuna o Te Awa, tēnei ka mihi kia koutou katoa. Nau mai whakapiri mai, nau mai whakakotahi mai, I raro I te maru o tēnei wānanga kōrero. Nei rā, e te tira whakamātaki, e mihi kau atu ana kia koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai. Kia tīmata pai tātou, I te toi ngā whakaaro o te wāhingaro, me noi tātou. Wairea I runga, wairea I raro, wairea I roto, wairea I waho. Wairea I ngā rā I mui a tātou, wairea I ngā taukāia ka wainganui a tēnā ki tēnā. Tēnei tātou, e tuku whakamoemiti ki te wāhingaro, ki wairua mai kia tātou, e rongo whakairia ki runga, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna. Haumie huie, tai ki e. Kia ora everyone, and welcome to, I think this is our third or fourth webinar in our series as we lead up to our Māori Biosecurity Symposium, which we'll get to later on this evening. Tonight, though, we are very blessed to have two awesome speakers talking about the future of conservation, two very dear friends of mine and two idols that I highly look up to, and I highly recommend anyone listening to everything they say because it is truly valuable. But I won't talk too much to that. What I'll do is I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves before we have a kōrero from our CEO. So with that, I'll pass on to our first speaker, Dion. Over to you, e hoa.
Kia ora tame. Nei rā te mihi ki a koe e hoa. Nō reira, ko toka maru ko kura haupō ngā waka, ko Taranaki te maunga, ko Ngāti Mutunga, Ngāti Tama, Te Ātiawa, Taranaki ngā iwi, nei rā te mihi o tēnei mokopuna o Taranaki maunga ki a koutou katoa, nō reira ko Dion Tuuta tōpū ingoa. He mihi nui ki a koutou, ko tai mai nei I rungi te reo kāranga o te kaupapa nei, nō reira he mihi aroha ki a koe tame, mō tō mihi kia māua ko aroha. Nō reira, nei rā te mihi o maunga Taranaki ki a koe, o tira ki a koe aroha, ki a koe kia pūtaua ki maunga, he mihi aroha ki a koutou katoa. Nō reira, huri noa, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for that introduction there, Tame. A little bit embarrassing, wasn't expecting that one, but really looking forward to, thanks for the invitation to be here tonight, e hoa, and looking forward to the kōrero. Kia ora.
Oh, it was truly our pleasure. So, nei rā te mihi ki a koe hoki e hoa. Aroha, over to you to introduce yourself.
Kia ora Tame. Yes, as with Dion, a bit whakamā with your introduction. It's a bit glowing and hope we can meet your standards. Kia ora koutou, he uria no Ngāti awa, me Ngāti Porou, me tūharangi hoki, ko Aroha te Pareake Mead ahau. It's wonderful to be able to share with you this work that we were involved in through the Options Development Group. New Zealand's conservation policy has been a pet peeve of mine for decades, and being able to actually sort of deep dive into the underlying issues has been a very worthwhile part of my work over the past year, and I'm looking forward to being able to share with you what we've been doing, what we've recommended, and also hearing from you what your areas of interest are. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe aroha. So, the purpose of tonight's webinar, tonight's kōrero, I have titled it, or we have titled it, The Future of our Conservation System. And we'll get into that, we'll get to that in a sec. I'm just wondering, Mel, are you available? I'll pass over to Mel, our founder and one of our CEOs, quickly welcome us as well.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi kia tame for the introductions and the welcome, and kia ora Aroha and Dion, and thank you for joining us today. we're really privileged to have you both joining us and to talk about this mahi that you have been involved in with the ODG report, but also, as Tami said, the future of conservation and how we manage our taonga. Te Tira Whakamātaki is kind of a future-focused organisation. We were established in large part to respond to a future incursion, myrtle rust. So I've talked about it, many of you have heard me talk about it a number of times. We established to think about future pests and diseases and what they might do to us. We do to our taonga species in particular, and then we stayed in existence because we were thinking about how do we respond and how do we think about resilience, how do we think about reducing risk, and for us that looks like seed conservation, it looks like law reform, it looks like building capability and having new governors in the wider environmental biosecurity conservation space, governors that reflect Te Ao Māori, can bring te tiriti and can understand our aspirations as Māori in the system. We're really excited that conservation law reform is on the table. We're really excited that it has big, strong voices like Aroha, like Dion, like Tami at the table to think about what conservation or protection and restoration, which is probably some better languages in conservation, words in conservation looks like in the future. We're really excited to share some initiatives as well later tonight before we wrap up, that make some announcements about things that we're doing in the future. But again, just handing it back to you, Tami, and super excited to have you, Aroha and Dion, join us. Aroha sits on our kahui, so she's really intimate with our work. Dion's the kind of person that we try and attract to our kahui and to our groups, and we want to work with and work alongside of. So really pleased to have you both here. I'll hand back to you, Tami.
Thank you for that, Mel, and I'm glad you dropped that passive-aggressive hint to Dion as well, because I keep dropping it to him as well. So tonight's kaupapa is the future of conservation, and as some of you may be aware, the Options Development Group spent the last 2 years looking at the Department of Conservation's general policies. After a lot of wānanga, hui and noho, 7 recommendations came out of it. I won't get into too much details about that, but hopefully our kai kōrero for tonight will go through it. But to give you an idea of the calibre of people involved in the ODG, I'll now give our speakers an opportunity to describe their journey. How did they get to where they are now, and who influenced them, what influenced them? Like I said, they are highly influential, and I mean, everything they say to me is gold. So what was that journey like, and how can other people follow that? So we'll start with you, Dion. Do you want to describe your journey?
Okay, kia ora for that, Tami. No pressure. All right. So my journey started out, right. So my main background really has been in the things that I'm really interested in is treaty relations. So although I was on the Options Development Group, I wasn't, my original interest in participating in the Options Development Group wasn't so much for the conservation elements of it. It was, but it was around the power structures around conservation and how we as Aotearoa have organised ourselves. So what permits, what defines what is conservation and what isn't conservation in many ways. And the reason being my background is actually essentially it's in treaty relations. So I'm from Taranaki. When I was a teenager, all of my iwi Taranaki was going through the Waitangi tribunal process. So I was heavily influenced as a young person, watching my parents and my uncles and aunts and my grandparents all going through the treaty settlement process. And when I was at high school, I was sitting in hearings, listening to this stuff, learning things about what had happened to us in Taranaki and how we had suffered at the hands of the Crown via confiscation, which then sort of like opened my eyes to why the world is like it is in Taranaki and why all of my whānau seemed to be poor and a whole lot of people, other people were not poor in Taranaki, and why the social order was the way it was. And anyway, that put me on a sort of journey to sort of eventually going to university, and I ended up becoming a historian and studying up for the Waitangi Tribunal. So my career was originally started out in history, Then after a little bit of doing that, I went and worked for the Crown Forestry Rental Trust, working with other with iwi throughout the country, building my network amongst iwi. And that's where I met Paul Morgan, who I see is on the call here tonight. When Paul was on the board of CFRT through FOMA, and then through that I got involved in my career. Essentially became built around treaty settlements. I was a negotiator for Ngāti Mutunga, so I had inside knowledge and understanding of direct experience of treaty negotiations. And then after going through that experience, came home to Taranaki to help establish Te Runanga o Ngāti Mutunga and our administration systems there, and just sort of being involved in Taranaki iwi politics. And then after that, I became the chief executive of Paraninihi Ki Waitotara Incorporation, which is the biggest land incorporation here in Taranaki, 20,000 hectares of land. And I was the CEO there for about 8 years, which really brought me to for the first time in my life, really, in some ways, to the real coalface of land management and the impacts of primary industries on the land, because PKW, as we're known, is one of the largest, it's the largest corporate dairy farmer in Taranaki. And so, you know, understanding the realities of, okay, the balancing between corporate activities, but also the need to act as a proper kaitiaki over whenua. And then from there, I became the CEO of Te Kaimwana, where I was located in Wellington for 5 years, 4.5 years in total, actually. Where I see Reto Blattner is on the phone, on the line tonight. Reto worked with me there. He was a summer intern through Victoria. He was fantastic to work with, and he's just graduated. So good on him, good on you, Reto. But when I was at Te Kaimwana, my core role there was really to work, I'll say, with the government, to remind them of the obligations that they have to us as iwi Māori in terms of the 1992 fisheries settlement. And that one was a real challenging one, because societal views around commercial fisheries have changed significantly over the past 30 years. And one of our key roles was to uphold the promises made in the treaty settlement. But as society has evolved, and we as a people ourselves have evolved, our reliance on fisheries as a commercial asset has lessened in many ways as a result of treaty settlements and other economic developments that have occurred over the past 30 years as well. So our own attitudes towards these activities are changing and evolving. And then, so after 4.5 years at Te Kaimwana, an opportunity to come home cropped up as the Pouwhakahaere of Te Kotahitanga o Te Ātiawa. And with COVID and everything, I really wanted to come home and help out back at home. And so decided that I'd had enough Wellington, and Taranaki was where I wanted to be, as I always had been anyway. And so decided to come home. But the thing, essentially the key things that have shaped who I am really, is, you know, it's my parents, it's my uncles and aunts, it's people, but I've been lucky to be, you know, through their example, hardworking people who put me in a position to actually take advantage of opportunities that came my way. Those opportunities put me in contact with people like, you know, Sir Graham Latimer, Sir Tipene Regan, the Paul Morgans of this world, and just many other people who I was lucky enough to be nurtured by and encouraged to be able to get into these, to sort of do the sorts of things which have placed me in a position to be on things like the Options Development Group. And so I feel really privileged to have been through that, to you know, meet people such as yourself and Aroha, work on these things, and then hopefully build on the platform that I was provided to help our whānau and our iwi, and us as iwi, te iwi Māori, really realise our potential around what I think we were guaranteed and promised under Te Treaty of Waitangi. So I guess that's the thing, the core thing for me about the Options Development Group was how conservation law reform can be used to actualise Te Treaty in a modern context. That was a bit long-winded there, but yeah.
No, there's a lot to unpack there. And if we get time at the end, I will come back to them because there were some really good things that I'd really like to really dive into. I see the commonality with a lot of your mahi and experiences and your skills as being challenging the government on their promise and their obligations to iwi Māori. So at the end, we'll probably circle back to a lot of those and really unpack them. Aroha, I think I remember when I heard you were speaking at an event one time, I Googled you and I had to click on, I think, 3 pages down on the Google pages just because there was that much. So I'll hand over to you now to introduce yourself and describe your journey.
Kia ora. Well, my journey is really quite different from Dion's, but that's part of why I enjoyed the Options Development Group, is that we all came from really different spaces. In my case, I moved all around the world following my parents, who were teachers. My father, who was an academic, he did his PhD in the US in the 1960s, and then he taught in Canada. So I actually spent 15 years of my life in total overseas. And because of the way my father was, he always ensured that wherever we lived, we learned about being Indigenous and who was Indigenous of that place. So I was always very conscious of the difference between Indigenous people and the other people in society. And then I stayed in Canada after my parents returned back to New Zealand. And I was actually there during the big Canadian Constitution drive in the 1980s. And I got very involved because I was living in Ottawa. I got very involved with the First Nations organisations who are all based in Ottawa. And then after a time, I became so involved, I just thought I really should be doing this at home. So I moved home. So it was the Canadians who got me home. And then I got involved through my iwi, got involved in the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, got involved with National Māori Congress, which sort of predates the Iwi Chairs Forum. And through the National Māori Congress, participated in the Earth Summit, the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development. And there, you'd have to say, was a sort of a light bulb moment for me, because it took until 1992 for the governments of the world to actually acknowledge that there is a link between environment and development. And I was absolutely dumbfounded that countries could be so dumb, that it would take them so long to work out these fundamental, the interrelationship between development and environmental issues. Then I got invited to join the IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Governing Council. And so I spent 16 years on the Governing Council of IUCN, and through that, I really learned about conservation, the history of conservation, the history of all of the norms and standards that are used in conservation policy and practice, including those that we follow here in New Zealand. And it always puzzled me. 2 things puzzled me. One was, why is this a consistent experience with Indigenous peoples globally that conservationists seem to universally get in their way, and the relationship is not a positive one? And whereas you'd think that here we'd have more in common because we all care about the environment, why is it that there are sites of conflict all across the globe that come down to this fundamental issue of a difference about what conservation is? And the other thing that struck me is that seeing the way that DOC behaved in New Zealand, the sort of high moral ground that it occupied, in issues around conservation, I couldn't help but notice that they were missing in action as a global player. And whenever there were big events like the World Conservation Congress, I'd look around to see, where's New Zealand? You know, where's our side events? Where are they promoting all of these amazing things that they reckon that they're doing? And they didn't have anything. They were totally invisible. And then I began to realize that they weren't there because they actually knew that their standards don't meet what is happening at the global level in conservation, that everything is moving forward, everything is progressing. We're looking at different styles of conservation, far more advanced in the whole notion of decolonizing conservation. And New Zealand's just wasn't ready to participate in those discussions. So I've just become totally immersed in the whole dynamic of conservation, the conservation system, and decolonizing conservation. And I brought all of that into the appointment with the Options Development Group. And I couldn't wait to get involved, to be able to, you know, pull up my sleeves and actually delve into policy at a New Zealand level and really look at the root causes, what our legislation says, what it doesn't say, how far behind we are. Because nationally, we are very far behind in how countries are implementing conservation or what they see as good conservation practice. So that also was a bit of a lengthy introduction about my journey, but I kind of live and breathe in this space.
No, that's a brilliant introduction, and it gives our listeners, those live now and those that'll be watching the recording of this, an idea of the caliber of people involved in the ODG and the experiences that they brought with them. Because I think the ODG report, which we'll get into in a sec, is upheld by the mana of those involved. So tēnei ka mihi kia kōrua nā wi whakamana ake I taua tuhingara I taua I pōtara. So with that, Dion, I might go to you now for this one. I heard you on the radio talking about the ODG, and you described it quite nicely about the instructions on how to drive the vehicle or something like that. So do you want to give us a rundown of what the ODG did? Or yeah,
why was it actually created and all of that sort of stuff? I mean, your listeners are probably familiar with it, but the need for this review was initiated by the 2018 Supreme Court ruling in regards to the Ngāti ki Tamaki case, where Ngāti ki Tamaki Tribal Trust challenged the Department of Conservation's application of Section 4 when it awarded some concessions in favour of Fullers to Motutapu Island, and in favour of Fullers and the Motutapu Island Restoration Trust. So basically DOC awarded 2 concessions to 2 organisations over the mana whenua of that particular island. And one of the decisions that the decision maker made was that they couldn't consider the economic impacts of that for Ngāti ki Tamaki in their decision. And the courts basically found that the department hadn't followed, the process they'd followed meant that they had not actually given proper effect to Section 4, which, as we're all aware, requires a decision maker to give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And it's supposedly, I say supposedly, one of the most powerful and directive sections in the law in terms of giving the application of Te Treaty of Waitangi. But effectively, the case found that the department didn't know how to give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And so they were asking why was that? And that's because the general policies, which are essentially the operations manual for how to translate what is written in statute into action. So if you think of those general policies like the operating manual for this machine called the Department of Conservation. Those general policies effectively did not, the general policies, in my view, were written in such a way as to frustrate the ability of staff to actually give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And you kind of need to understand the context within which they were written and the time they were written and everything that happened. Because, you know, laws evolve, they're a product of a particular time. And the Conservation Act was written in 1987. And a lot of the ideas around things like the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, those are relatively modern concepts, right? And they are results of legal action that we as Māori have taken against the Crown and its continual failure to uphold and to live up to the promises of the treaty. And so notions of the principles of the treaty, they come out of things like the lands case, seminal legal cases, like the lands case, where the Court of Appeal and the Court of Appeal found that basically found that, you know, Māori were being screwed over time and again by the Crown, and found that the Crown had a duty to uphold these things called the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. But then in the 80s, the Crown themselves, with this new area of law, the Crown took it upon itself to define what those principles were. And and this is my own view, when looking at the general policies, it became a sort of self-fulfilling exercise in how to, because the Crown writes the policies on how to give effect to the law, it became a bit of an exercise in how to moderate what the court had found. And so to effectively maintain the status quo, where we as iwi Māori had gone through a significant process through the courts, had one significant victory, which essentially said, and this is my crass paraphrasing, that that partnership was something to be looked at, that was a principle, and that the Crown needed to act as a better treaty partner. And then the Crown defined the principles and would define how those would be given action, and actually would define almost like a priority order of those things. So the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi is articulated in the general policies, include things such as kāwanatanga. I think that's the first principle, i.e. the right of the Crown to make law. Rangatiratanga is the second one, but rangatiratanga defined as iwi have the right to self-manage within the law, within the confines of the law. There's a couple of others which I can't sort of remember off the top of my head right now, but essentially the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi is articulated in the general policies, create a power structure in the reader's mind, right? That's my particular view. And so, like policies and law and all of these things, they are a reflection of the person who writes them. They are, they set down the tikanga of how things are of how things will be run. And so, if they've been written in such a way to ensure that the Crown ultimately maintains power and control and the status quo, but without real reference or input from its treaty partner. I mean, that's my somewhat blunt view of the whole thing. And I'll be interested in Aroha's view of that. But the general policies, so they've been written in a way so that the key chapter we were supposed to review was chapter 2, which was specifically about how to give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And when you read chapter 2, which is about forming partnerships with tangata whenua, because words like, I don't think iwi, the word iwi, I don't think that appears in the general policies. So when forming relationships with tangata whenua, which is a treaty-based approach according to section 4, if you read section chapter 2 and chapter 3, which is about forming partnerships with non-tangata whenua, they're exactly the same. So the rules, there's no real delineation or no real difference made in the mind of a DOC staff member according to the general policies, apart from the fact that one is tangata whenua. There's no preference given to Māori as treaty partner under the general policies that I could read, that I could see under the general policies. So in practical effect, it gave no guidance to the staff around what giving effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi actually meant. And it's been like that since 1987, right? So it was a real eye-opener for me. I had never had anything to do, well, I'd had sort of little things to do with the Department of Conservation, but I'd never had any reason to delve into the conservation legislation before. And it was a real eye-opener for someone such as myself, who comes from an iwi-based background, who views the treaty partnership as being something of actual importance to this nation. To read a piece of really critically important legislation, which actually spoke about giving effect to the principles of the treaty, but then in no way provided any way of actually giving effect to that. It was just incredible. And when you read it, it became really clear that the current legislation privileges certain cultural activities, right? So it privileges things like tramping through the Ngāhere, climbing maunga, fishing for trout, tramping and looking at things. But it does not privilege other cultural activities like collecting taonga wharongoa, harvesting manu for toi Māori, right? So it creates, it basically says these things are acceptable, these things we will control. So the Conservation Act is a very, it's I don't want to say this because I know this is being recorded, but but it was just really interesting how the iwi as a treaty partner were essentially completely absent in that legislation, apart from Ngai Tahu, who had essentially almost had to fight to get in there because of the scale of how much conservation land is within their takiwa. So that was a bit of a rambling all over the place kind of answer. Aroha's probably got something a little bit more articulate than that.
No, that's good. It gives us a good background, and I mean, anything you can't say, I'll say. The conservation system is rubbish. I was fascinated to learn that our conservation system was built from a need by early Crown to protect introduced species. Those, what do they call them? When they released a new animal shelters and societies.
What do you call them? Aroha? Acclimatization societies.
That's the one, yeah. So we built off that. Exactly.
So, with my sort of naive eyes when I looked at it, the cynic in me, and those who know me know that I can be quite cynical at times. Part of me was more interested in calling it the Recreational Act, the Preservation of Areas for Recreation Act, more so than a Conservation of TaiAo Act. It was, and in many ways, it privileged certain interest groups over the treaty partner. So certain, this is not me running down the voluntary efforts of people who care about conservation in New Zealand, but none of them signed the Te Treaty of Waitangi, all right? Which guaranteed one part of that equation, certain promises, right? So the New Zealand Conservation Authority is made up of conservation people who really, really care about conservation, but the treaty partner is by and large not absent, but it's certainly not. It's not the sort of level of partnership that I would have thought was appropriate for a taonga of something of this national importance for all of us, but particularly for us as iwi Māori. Given the history of our relationship with our whenua, and in many cases the way that whenua has been lost to our control. So yeah, it's been an interesting experience for me in terms of seeing how it works as a power structure.
Again, a lot to unpack, but I use the example all the time when I talk about treaty or te tiriti. When my tupuna signed it from Ngāti Tarāwhai, who were famous carvers at the time, never did they envision that within 200 years, their descendants would have to apply to the Crown to get access to carved wood. It just seems very backwards. So knowing all that now, Aroha, we'll go to you to talk about the recommendations. You don't have to talk about all 7 of them, so if there's a particular one you wanted to talk about. But yeah, what were some of the recommendations?
Sure, but before I answer that, let me just go back a little bit as well. So in looking at the general conservation policies, those don't sit in isolation. They were written, as Dion said, because they were to be the practical implementation of legislation. And so we went straight to the legislation. And, when you consider the Wildlife Act was enacted in 1953, the Marine Mammals Act in 1978, the Conservation Act in 1987, and we had our first treaty settlement in 1989. We've since had 73 settlements that have been enacted in law. So these pieces of legislation really stand out for not having survived over time, not being relevant over time. And in the Conservation Act, there were particular areas that really concerned us. One was the definition of conservation, which, here in Aotearoa, we could easily develop an amazing definition based on being in this place and living in this environment. And instead, it's just a definition transported from overseas. Secondly, there's no commitment to the preservation of Indigenous species. And you would expect that to be a cornerstone of a Conservation Act, that you actually prioritise your taonga, those species that are endemic to New Zealand. And it's not surprising, therefore, that because they weren't prioritised in legislation, that it's those very species that we see the annual figures showing a decline. And the decline over the past 50 years has just been at a massive scale. Also, Dion mentioned that the Act, the way it's written, it prioritises the interests of the recreational users. They were the main lobby group at the time, and Māori are, for all intents and purposes, quite absent. They're invisible in the Act. Furthermore, when we did the review of legislation, we found that there are actually provisions in some of the acts that directly inhibit or prohibit the Director General from delegating authority to Māori. So even if a Director General wanted to be more, more useful and constructive in their relationships with iwi, the Act, the way it's written, means that they can't do that. But the most bizarre of all the acts is the Wildlife Act of 1953. Bizarre because it gives ownership of wildlife to the Crown. And the Crown didn't even do that in an articulate or elegant way. When you read the Act, you just realise that it just assumed ownership. So it doesn't even make a great statement of what it owns or why it owns or give a commitment to it owning. It's just an assumed ownership with no moral or legal authority behind it. So we find that in 2022, because this Act is still around, we have this perverse situation with our weavers For instance, our artists who aren't technically the owners of their work, because anything that involves the feathers of our native birds is owned by the Crown. And similarly in the Marine Mammals Act, that's why we have to have all of these MOUs with DOC in order to access customary materials from beach whales, because the Crown assumes ownership of those. So the recommendations of the Options Development Group, there's a whole cluster that looks at legal reform and legal reform across the entire conservation system. So we don't think that you can just take the Conservation Act by itself and amend it and that would be enough. You actually have to look at all of the pieces of legislation, because each one kind of builds on this assumed authority. The other, I guess, big finding that we came up with is that this whole notion of owning nature is really unhelpful. It hasn't proven to be the epitome of success in terms of conservation results. In fact, you could say it probably gets in the way of good conservation, because you end up arguing, as the Crown has done, over boundaries and authority, instead of actually focusing on the issues of wildlife. So we want to see ownership of wildlife taken off the Crown and either vested equally with the treaty partner, or else a clear statement that no one owns nature, and any kind of authority to manage our wildlife has to be a treaty partnership model. We also feel that it was important to undertake a review of all of the classifications of our protected areas. We have 33% of our land that's managed in a conservation estate. This is one of the highest percentages globally in a country, and in spite of this large amount, we still have this huge decline in biodiversity. So we want a systematic review over all the different classifications, and in reviewing those classifications of land, have a serious look at returning as much as possible back to iwi, back to hapu and iwi to manage. The truth of the matter is that the Crown might like to own 30%, but it can't afford to manage 30%. It doesn't have the financial resources, it doesn't have the human resources, and it doesn't have the information that's needed on the ground to conserve our species and to halt the decline of the damage that has been done by all these predators that were brought into the country by design through poor policies and poor practices. So in a nutshell, revoking Crown ownership of Indigenous species, undertaking a review of all the classifications applied to public conservation lands, reforming the ownership model of public conservation lands and waters to reflect the enduring relationships that tangata whenua have. And we also looked at the New Zealand Conservation Authority being the only example where the Director General has delegated authority for decision making around conservation at place, and requiring that to be a treaty partnership model, and therefore a reform of its current model. So those are just some. I'm sure that you I'm sure that the people who are listening to this would have some questions, which I'm more than happy to answer. But yes, recasting of the entire conservation system is long overdue, and it really needs to be done for the sake of nature. This is not just a pro-Māori agenda. This is actually a pro-nature agenda. This is what is best for our Taonga species. Kia ora, Tami.
Totally agree. I just got a text from a weaver as well saying that they were surprised to learn that, yeah, if they weave something or if they make something, and the same applies for rongoā. I see some rongoā practitioners on here. Yeah, that it's in fact owned by the Crown, which, yeah, just seems so backward. As I said, our tupuna didn't sign it thinking that that would be the case. You mentioned something else. I'll just pick up on the Wildlife Act. I understand that that's going to be looked at. Are you allowed to talk about it?
Yes, it's been publicly announced. So for me, this is really exciting because we've never had an opportunity to discuss at a high level the reform of the Wildlife Act. It was the subject of the Y262 claim. There's a whole chapter about it in the Ko Aotearoa Tēnei report that the Waitangi Tribunal produced about the Y262 claim. But this is the first time a government has signalled a willingness to open the Wildlife Act for review. So it's only recently been announced. They're just in the process of appointing a committee to help provide guidance and advice. And I think it'll be a 1 year sort of landscape to do the work. But it's critical. It's absolutely critical that this act from 1953 is brought up to 2022 and is in fact fit for purpose for the year 3000.
I like that. And for those in charge at DOC, if they are listening, I will pay you in goats if I can be a part of that team that ripped that act apart. That has been the bane of my existence and my whole time with the conservation system. Got a really good partai here. Can go to both of you, in fact. The future of marine conservation. Dion, given your previous role in Aroha, given your huge interest in this space, I'm sure. Dion, any whakaaro on that?
Yeah, I got a few. But essentially, it's the same issue, I think, and it's really around. I mean, it's no secret, right, that I was the head of Te Ohu Kaimoana when we were staunchly opposed to the Kumiriq Ocean Sanctuary. Now, a lot of people accused me of being anti-marine protection because I was opposed to the Kumiriq Ocean Sanctuary. What I was actually opposed about was Māori rights being stripped in Fisheries Management Area 10 without consent. And in fact, every iwi, and the point I just made to the minister, Nick Smith at the time, was if he had simply made the case and actually had enough respect to engage with his treaty partner, 58 mandated iwi organisations, and explain the situation around why the Kumiriq Ocean Sanctuary, why he thought it was a good idea, then I have no doubt that that would have been agreed to. The fact that he presumed to just confiscate those rights essentially without even consultation is essentially was part of the issue. So the Kumiriq, I think a lot of people mistakenly think the Kumiriq, the opposition to the Kumiriq Ocean Sanctuary had nothing to do with actual marine issues at all. It had to do with the total lack of respect that the Crown had for its treaty partner, and it was really about the way that the Crown made law in modern day Aotearoa after less than 25 years after signing that settlement. But I guess, a key principle around, but to the actual question around the future of marine management, I think for me it is actually still built into the essential nature of the 1992 fisheries settlement, which is actually one of the it is actually a principle that the ODG built into our report, and it comes back to that principle around partnership and working collaboratively between the partners to actually agree the best way to do it, rather than have what we have at the moment, which is the centralized, we know best, and we will impose a solution from you above, and you will comply, right? because marine management, effectively, what you're really talking about is, or any kind of environmental management, you're not managing the environment, you're managing people's interactions with it. And so that has to be done in an appropriate way, all right? And one of the interesting things I found about like marine management, particularly when I was at Te Kaimwana, there were so many people who were so anti-New Zealand's fishing system, commercial fishing system, yet knew nothing about it, right? And knew absolutely nothing about it apart from what they'd heard on the news, right? And the news is not a news. I can tell you from personal experience, news media outlets, they are not objective creatures. The news media stories can be just as skewed to present a particular angle depending on the particular perspective a reporter wants to take. So our fisheries management system is incredibly misunderstood. Very, very few people actually understand how it works. I think there is a mindset amongst many New Zealanders that New Zealand's fisheries are overexploited commercially, that foreign vessels are coming in and plundering our resources. None of that actually happens.
Yeah.
Our quota management system is designed to really minimise the amount that is actually taken. Sorry, Aroha, looks like you want to say something.
I might jump in here before you go off on fisheries. But just to say that, there's growing literature that at the global level that proves that just the arbitrary setting of targets of protected areas, whether it's land-based or marine-based, isn't in itself going to create the kind of biodiversity outcomes people are seeking. It's not about the numbers, it's about the actual way of conserving. And if we don't want to repeat the colonial history of the way in which land-based protected areas were established, as in taking lands away from Indigenous peoples, we don't want to repeat that in the marine space. So that idea of, or the principle of talking to the mana whenua, of getting an agreement, absolutely essential to any new marine protected area. But alongside that has to be a change in the conservation practice. Yep. To ensure that we get the right outcomes.
Well, follow-up question then for you, Aroha. In terms of future of conservation, can there be a successful future of conservation within Aotearoa without those recommendations?
Absolutely not. Absolutely, without a question, no way. The ODG were a very diverse group of people. We didn't just come in there with our pet issues. We also had members who were from DOC. We had members who are from the New Zealand Conservation Boards, who were really familiar with conservation policy. And we worked together to dissect the legislation and the policies and why our conservation status is so poor. How have we got to the state that we've got to? And we were all unanimous, even if we started from different places, we ended up with these unanimous recommendations that there has to be a full reset of the conservation system in order for it to work. And just tinkling with one piece of legislation or rewriting one section of the conservation policies is not going to do it. It's a major overhaul. And it's a matter of priority, because if we don't do it, we're going to lose species. We're going to lose more species than we already have. That was such an easy question to answer.
Staying with you, Aroha, you mentioned before that you want to decolonise the system. Is it possible to decolonise a colonial construct, or is it better to just start from scratch?
Well, there are similar debates going on, in the museum industry, or in the museum sector, about decolonising museums, and people come to that same philosophical base. Can you actually change what is an inherently colonial system and make it more responsive to Indigenous ways of being and of relating to things? Or do you have to just destroy it and start over? I think that I wouldn't throw the baby, what is it? I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I would consider what we've experienced so far with the colonial systems. They've had their day. They were a start. We shouldn't just throw them out completely, because there are some aspects of them that are very useful, and there's some knowledge that's been generated. When you look at the knowledge that's in, say, our taxonomic collections about biodiversity, it's gold. It's absolutely amazing stuff. You don't want to just discard all of that. So I would be more in favour of reform, but radical reform.
I like that. Dion, over to you for the last question. It seems like your life, despite how chill and cool you are, has been around fighting the government. How much more fight do you think is left in this space?
Fighting. I'm actually a real conflict-averse person, Tama. I don't like fighting anybody. But what I do like doing is sort of explaining and highlighting inconsistencies in behaviour, I think is a better way of putting it. And trying to get people to live up to their promises, I suppose, is one way of putting it, rather than fighting. Although, but it is I think it's something that I carry with me just because I'm from Taranaki and you know, and we've suffered what we've suffered up here. So, I guess I fight the government all the time. Sorry, what's your question again?
Well, do you think this is going to be an ongoing fight to change the concept for that radical reform Aroha mentioned? Is it going to be a lifetime? Is it going to be multiple lifetimes?
I think, actually, it's a good question. I think, I don't think it's going to be as hard as it was in the 80s, because I think, you know, there's a growing consciousness among all citizens of Aotearoa of the need to do this sort of stuff, right? And to do it in a way that is more authentically Aotearoa, right? Because we are Pacific Islanders, you know, we're a Pacific nation, we're a Polynesian nation, and even our tangata treaty are becoming, you know, in their own particular way, those who are a little bit more open-minded, let's say, indigenized in their own particular way, right? And despite my, I'm actually really, I realized the other day that I'm actually a very hopeful person, and I see a lot of positive stuff happening. Now, if you know, I listen to young people of all, you know, young people care about Te TaiAo. Like, they really care about it. They really are worried about it. More so that they're much more environmentally conscious at the same age that I was at their age, you know, and so that is a positive thing. I think they're also, you know, their ability, well, you know, the co-governance, let's say, hysteria being promoted by politicians for political purposes. I think that, you know, there's a positive upside to that too, because there are people who are still willing to actually keep an open mind and learn and understand what it actually is, because essentially that strikes to the heart of what we're talking about in this ODG report, is actually about us as a society reconsidering how we collectively decide to operate some fundamentally important systems for the benefit of Te TaiAo and conservation and the environment, right? And that's what, and so in a conservation context, that's what we're really talking about with co-governance, is different ways of thinking. And I think New Zealand 21st century Aotearoa is kind of, I give 21st century Aotearoa a little bit more benefit of the doubt. The naysayers get a lot of airtime, but it's the squeaky wheel, right, that gets the oil, right? So there will always be ups and downs, right? So the treaty, some people in the 80s, the treaty, some people say it had its zenith in the 80s, around when it had its influence over public policy and discourse. I don't think so. I think we are back, and then it went away, people move against it, but it's come back again. But it's more relevant now. We have, we as people, we as a nation, as like Aotearoa, and we as Ngāiwi Māori, we have developed, we have learnt, we have more resources, we have greater capacity to engage with these things in a much more proactive way than we did. So we have a foundation, a real positive foundation that we have been bequeathed from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 80s to the 2000s. And I think what we are doing with this work, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm so proud of this ODG work, is that it really celebrates whakaaro Māori and the what it can bring to Aotearoa for the future as a positive platform. And I think that if people engage with it constructively, we won't need to fight. Right? We'll be having a positive conversation as treaty partners and as citizens of Aotearoa who care about our environment and the world we're going to leave for our tamariki.
Hi, Tera. I've just realised the time, and I'm sure we could keep going all night with this wānanga. And as I said, I'd pay a lot of goats for that as well. I'd gladly give up my flock of goats to keep this wānanga going. Before we do jump to some other stuff, or close our hui, I should say, I just want to pass over to Mel for an announcement. As some of you, those who've been watching our webinars, you'll notice I keep dropping really dumb hints that we've got something big coming. I don't know how to keep a secret, and my wife will be the first to tell you. But with that, I'll pass over to you, Mel.
Kia ora Tami, and I just want to acknowledge the amazing kōrero from you, Dion and Aroha, and I think we could probably stay on for another hour, and we might end up doing that. I forgot to tell Aroha and Dion at the outset that quite often we say our webinars close at 7:38, Tami, but we're usually on for another 40 minutes because people are just so excited and asking lots of questions. I hope you blocked your night out, because I suspect there'll be lots of questions. It is a really interesting whakaaro, thinking about, as you said there, on the future and being hopeful about the system change that we can make. System change is something that we're really passionate about at Te Tira Whakamātaki. Ultimately, we want to see a system that thinks, it puts the environment first, but also thinks about equity and fulfilling the promises made in Te Tiriti. We were established with a tono from Matua Kevin Prime to ensure that there was a Māori voice in the biosecurity system in particular, but the caveat he gave us was to protect that voice in the biosecurity system. He said there's one thing to make sure that you're there, that you're advocating, that you're banging the tables, and I'm sure Joe Darby, who's online working for Biosecurity New Zealand, knows that we like to bang tables and demand that we have a seat and we have a voice. But Matua Kevin was really clear to us that ultimately our job is to protect that voice and make sure it stays in the system as well. As part of that whakaaro that they gave, the challenge and the tono he gave us in 2017 was the gifting of our name, Te Tira Whakamātaki. And Te Tira Whakamātaki is, loosely the watchful ones. And our logo has many meanings. The one that's sitting behind Simon, it's a triangle with an eye. It also alludes to our landscape, our mountains, the steps, the pathways we have to go to get there. And it has a whakapapa and a legacy of its own, Te Tira Whakamātaki, the name. It comes out of a group that many of you may know was stood up many, many years ago by you, Sean Ogilvie, and I see that you're online, called Ngā Mata Pōpori, which was about ensuring that there was a Māori voice in the 1080 conversation, and they too were the watchful ones, watching over 1080 and what was happening in the Ngāhere. So we're really, really excited to announce that at the end of July, with the support of Biosecurity New Zealand and the Ko Tātou This Is Us program, and with the support of mana whenua, Te Ātiawa, Dion in particular, we will be having a Māori Biosecurity Symposium called Te Wānanga Whakamātaki, as the name says behind me, in New Plymouth and Taranaki on the 28th, 29th and 30th of July. So you're the first to hear, apart from those few people who have been organising it, that we will be in Taranaki on those dates, pulling together Māori industry, the biosecurity system, leaders and governors to think about what it means to be the watchful ones of the system, to be advocates for the biosecurity system and for the environmental system and the conservation system, whatever you may call it. And we are hoping that we can announce slowly over the next couple of weeks some of the amazing speakers that we hopefully have lined up. Couple of hints, some of them are online now. We're just trying to coax them gently into to turning up and presenting. But we're really excited about the lineup. We're balancing between having really big picture conversations like we've just had now, you know, the future conversations, what do we want to see in the system, with some real life examples of what our whānau are doing at place right now to protect and restore ngāhere, te wai and the like. So really excited to announce Te Wānanga Whakamātaki in New Plymouth and Taranaki with mana whenua, supported by Biosecurity New Zealand on the 28th, 29th and 30th of July. So block that into your diary, keep an eye on our Facebook, our website and the like for more information. Thanks, Hami.
Ora, so yeah, I've been trying to keep that a secret, but being terrible at it. In fact, I've been hinting at other people that, hey, we're doing this soon. Would you like to be a speaker? I did laugh before when Dion was going to just start naming people and giving them kaupapa kōrero. So rather than telling them, he was volunteering them on the spot, and this is going live, so they couldn't argue back, but we'll leave that kaupapa. I'm excited for it as well, because as Mel alluded to, there will be mātauranga shed there. Where that's sort of one of the things that really touches me deeply, is hearing mātauranga in practice to protect our environment. Hoi anō. Ia tātou ko ruku ki tēnei wānanga, ko ki te tātou I ngā rawa kei wanganu ia tātou te iwi Māori, ngā kōrero a Aroha, ngā kōrero hoki o Dion, me tēnei pia te kōrero meikore ake kōrua, ka muti haere te puna mātauranga pia. Engari, tēnei te mihi nui ki a kōrua, te mihi maioha, nā ui whakawātea ia kōrua anō, kia taimai ki wanganu ia tātou, kia whirawhira I e rā mātauranga, hei kai mā tātou katoa. Thank you, Dion and Aroha. It's been a lovely evening. I've certainly got pages and pages of notes that, yeah, definitely going to come in are going to be valuable later on. As mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and it will be up online on our social media platforms. We also have a transcript of it, so we take key points and key notes and put them in writing form. So if anyone wants a copy of that, please feel free to reach out. But with that, I'll close our hui, and then if anyone wants to stay on afterwards and have a casual chat, a few of us just hang on until we get bored of each other. Hoi anō, tēnei ka mihi anō kia kōrua. Mā te wāhingaro tātou e manaaki e tiaki, mā te wāhingaro hoki ngā whanonga e tiaki, me tēnei te kōrero, toi te whenua, whatu ngarongaro te tangata, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna haumie huie, tai ki.
Tai ki.